in class. So for today's class, we'll actually continue with JavaScript, and here we'll be talking about JavaScript functions. So I know when we talked about variables, we diverted into functions a little bit. That was when we talked about the function scope, the block scope, and also the global scope. So in this class today, we'll be dealing with functions properly. And here are the contents for today's class. So today's class is going to be very, very brief. We'll just be focusing on JavaScript functions. And this class is going to be an introductory class. So this means that we are not going to cover every single thing about functions due to the fact that the concept of functions is very wide in JavaScript. But having basic knowledge and understanding of functions can actually be gotten from today's class. So for today's class, we begin with what is a JavaScript function, which is the first section under this class. After this, we'll look into why JavaScript functions are important, like what is the need of these functions? Why should we use them? The functions could actually still do stuff that we just do normally in JavaScript, but then the functions actually have some benefits we stand to gain when we make use of them. So we'll get to know what these benefits are. We'll also get to look at into the JavaScript function definition. So here we'd see how you could actually define a function, and defining the function actually has a list of some keywords, just a list of things you have to put in place for the entire function to work. And all those things would also see them as a syntax. So we'd see all of them as a whole being together. Now after this, we'll look into how a JavaScript function is being called, or what you would call calling a JavaScript functions. So we'll get to see how you can actually call a JavaScript function. We'll see a brief syntax about that because, mind you, the syntax for definition and for calling a function, they are quite different. But in your entire program, you need to make use of both of them. So we'll also see that too. And then I'll give you guys a very brief example of the JavaScript function definition and calling a JavaScript function together. So it's just going to be one example, but it would have an example of the JavaScript definition and an example of the JavaScript being called. Now, after this, we'll get to look into the return statement, which is not really, I wouldn't say it's necessary, but then it's optional. If you want to use it, you can, but you can also decide not to use it. But then we'll get to know more about this return statement, how it is connected with JavaScript, what exactly it does, and we'll also get to see an example of a JavaScript syntax with the return statement. Now, lastly, we'll look into JavaScript function scope. So here we'll see how the scope of the function actually works regarding to local variables and global variables. And lastly, as you all know, we always end the class with a quick demo on what we've done so far. So we definitely have something on JavaScript functions when we get to our VS Code. Okay, so let's just begin. JavaScript functions. So what is a JavaScript function? Now very briefly, in JavaScript, a function is basically a block of code that is used to perform a specific task. So now if you look at this definition, you would see that there's nothing really special about this definition. It's almost similar to someone asking you what a program basically is. There's nothing special here. But what makes the function look unique is actually the way you would order it, the syntax and the the structure that you put in place to actually, you know, perform this task with your block of code. That's what makes the function different. But by definition, the function is just basically a block of code that is used to perform a specific task. So that's how it goes with JavaScript functions. Now, the next thing we have here is why JavaScript functions. So, like I said before, in this section, we'll get to know why JavaScript functions are important. Because, like I said before, the things that this function actually does, we could still do them even without making use of these functions. But by making use of these functions, there are some things we stand to benefit from. And first and foremost, Java's JavaScript functions are reusable. Now, for most codes we've written up until this moment, we've actually written them in such a way that we only use them just once and not multiple times. If you notice very well, everything we've been doing in JavaScript, we've been running them once. Aside from when we talked about looping, which could actually generate, you know, several outputs with different inputs, which was actually due to the fact that something there was incrementing. But aside that, for the rest of the codes we've been writing, they are not reusable. We've only just written them once and we've printed them out once. But here in JavaScript, functions can actually be reusable. And this actually means that you can make use of a function multiple times with different inputs. So, of course, this means that you don't necessarily need to start writing a block of code over and over and over again for each of these inputs. So, just imagine we were to perform a specific task with some block of codes and we needed to use different inputs without using functions. What we would need to do is to write a code for this input, a code for another input, a code for another input, like that. Now, the whole process might not really be stressful if our inputs are just 3, 4, 5. But what if you had like 10 inputs, 20 inputs, 30 inputs, 50 inputs? Does it mean that you'd have to write separate block of code for each of these inputs? No, you wouldn't need to do that. And that's why functions are very, very good to use. So here in JavaScript, when you write a particular function, you only need to write it once. And the moment you write it once, you can actually use as many inputs as you like in your program. In as much as you're always calling the function with these inputs, your program would always run. So the next reason why JavaScript function is important is because of the fact that it requires less coding. So this particular point cannot be overemphasized. And one thing I stand to believe is the fact that your code doesn't have to be too much for it to work. You could actually just write smarter codes and not lengthy number of codes. And the JavaScript functions here would actually help you to do that. So this particular point actually supports the first point, which is about reusability. And like I said before, rather than writing multiple codes for different inputs, here you just need to write the function once and then you can use different inputs to output whatever you want. Now, lastly, functions can be used to break down a complex task into smaller tasks. So, so far so good. I wouldn't say we've done anything complex yet, but then you might have a case of trying to get some mathematical calculations which could be complex and you might not know how to go about it. So with functions here, you can actually decide to break these complex tasks into smaller tasks. So this means that just imagine you have a particular task and there's a kind of mathematical expression you need to do that looks so overwhelming. So normally you might have a hard time beginning the whole task, but then with functions you can actually break down these tasks in smaller bits. You probably solve one mathematical calculation on one side, you solve the other one on another side, and then you create a general function that will connect the answer of the first function and the second function together. So with functions, you can actually make that kind of thing happen if you don't want to, go direct into solving everything at once. So far so good. These are the benefits of function, but I believe they are not limited to just this, but at least this should be enough for us to know about now. So next we have the JavaScript function definition. So far so good. We've learnt about variable declaration definition, object declaration definition. We've also learnt about arrays and others. So now we are focusing on function. And to define a JavaScript function, the following that you see on the screen are very, very important pieces to this definition. So the first item here is the function keyword itself. So here we know what a keyword is. A keyword is a reserved word in JavaScript which serves a specific purpose in the entire program. Now, these keywords cannot be used as identifier or variable names or object names or any kind of identifier out there. So you can see that here we have the function keyword, which plays an important role in defining a JavaScript function. So the next thing after the function keyword is the name of the function. So I believe we all know why this is important. Everything we've been working with so far, we've given it a name, be it a variable, an object, an array, a string, a number, they all have a name that they bear. So the function here is not different. It also has a name it must bear. So the name of the function is also an important piece of the function definition. Now the next thing we have is what I would call a list of parameters. Now this word parameters might be new to us, but no need to worry, it's very, very easy. Now a parameter is basically what we would call a placeholder variable. So what I mean is a parameter is still a variable, like normal variables we've been using. A parameter is the same, but a parameter is a special type of variable, something you would call a placeholder variable. Now it's a placeholder variable in the sense that these particular variables actually hold they're actually there to hold a particular value that will be sent to it. So that's what these parameters really are. They are just variables that exist within a function, and these variables will actually wait for a value to be passed into it before that value can be used within the function. So now these parameters are optional, which means they are not compulsory. But most of the times, you might need to make use of the parameters. At least you need to make use of them. And the parameters here are always enclosed in parentheses. That's this bracket symbol we have here. They're always enclosed within the parentheses. And for the last item of the function definition, we have the block of codes. So this is actually the actual thing we want to do within the function. You know, it's like the main thing, you know, the main recipe. Yeah. So that's where you have it, the block of code. And the block of code here is enclosed in the curly braces. So all this put together would actually enable you to define a JavaScript function appropriately. Okay, so here we have a very, very brief syntax of the JavaScript function. And like I said before, this syntax we have here is basically a combination of all these pieces that we've seen in the last slide. So if you look at this syntax, it begins with the function keyword, which is what we have right here. Next, you have your function name. For this, I just went with function underscore name. So this function underscore name here actually represents the name of the function or the function name. And if you look closely, after this we have our bracket with our parameters inside. And so you have param1, param2, and you can have as much as you need. And always remember to separate the parameters with the comma symbol. Now, I said before that these parameters are optional, they are not compulsory, but depending on what you want to do with functions would actually depend on if you need a parameter or not. And and lastly, in this syntax, we have the curly braces, which appears here, and you can see that in between the curly braces we have codes to be executed. So this particular region is where you would have the actual code you want to run in the program. So this is how a JavaScript function syntax appears briefly. Nothing very, very stressful, very straightforward and very easy. So next we have calling a JavaScript function. So now this particular part we are looking at today is actually a very, very important piece when learning about a function, because one of the things you need to know is the fact that functions will only be executed when they are called or invoked. So this actually means that the moment you write out a function, normally you just write your function, you start with the function keyword, you give it a name. If you actually need parameters, you give it a parameter, and you also put out your code block within the curly braces. The moment you do that now, your function will not be executed. So your function will just be there. It will be ready for execution, but it will not execute at all. And this is because you've not called that function. So for a function to actually execute, the function needs to be called or invoked, which is also the same as calling. So that's what you must do for the function to actually execute. And after this section, I would show you how to actually do the calling of a function. So the next thing to note here is the fact that a function can be called anywhere in your JavaScript program. So I made mention of the fact that functions are reusable, and because they are reusable, you can actually make use of different inputs to actually run them. So this means that with this particular function, you can actually call it anywhere you have these inputs. The functions are not limited. You can call them anywhere in your JavaScript program. So we'd also get to see how this could actually happen when we get to our VS Code. So an important thing we should note here is the fact that to call a function, the function name with a set of arguments will be required. So from what we can see on the screen, you can see a very, very brief syntax. It's just a one-line syntax. It's not even difficult. And this particular syntax is composed of the function name and a set of arguments. So this syntax we have here is what you would actually need to call a function. So this actually means that with this syntax, your function would execute when you call it. So now we already know about the function name. The only new thing here is the argument. And so the arguments here actually represents the values assigned to the parameters when a function is being called. So you can see that here we have two arguments in this syntax. So this actually means that the arguments here would represent the values that we actually need to, the values we actually need for the execution of our function. Then the parameters that I talked about before, I said they are the placeholder variables. So what this means is that this particular argument we have here, they're actually going to be passed into the parameters. So imagine we just have a brief example of a function that has a parameter of x and y. If we have a parameter of x and y, it means that by the time we call the function name, we should only have two arguments because the parameters are two. So this brings the point that the number of parameters we have in a function must be the same with the number of arguments we use to call that function. So it must not have a kind of mismatch. The arguments must not be more than the parameters. The parameters must not be more than the arguments. They must be of equal number for your code to work fine, at least for now. So going back to the example I made mention of, I said that you could have a function with a parameter xyz. Now xyz, in that case, they are all placeholder variables, and your function could actually have something like x plus y plus z. Now x plus y plus z will not actually work because they are variable names and they are not digits. But then for these parameters to hold this digit, you must make use of the argument when calling a function. So I'll probably say that for this example, I could have the function name with an argument of 2, 3, and 4. So these values 2, 3, and 4, they are actually arguments for this function, and x, y, z are the parameters. So this argument here will be passed into the parameters, and once they are passed into the parameters, your operation of x plus y plus z would actually be represented as 2 plus 3 plus 4. So that way your function would execute properly and you would get the exact output that you want. So lastly, before we leave here, I said that the parameters are optional, which means they are not compulsory. So this also means that if you do not have any parameters, you also do not need to have any arguments. So that means that for this particular syntax we have here, we can obviously call our function without any of these arguments being in this bracket. Now, mind you, this particular bracket here is always important when calling a function name. So if we were to call a function name by just this name without this empty bracket, it's not going to work. You always need to have this parenthesis or brackets attached to this function name when you are trying to call a function. So just a quick one before we go. The parameters are optional, and if you do not make use of parameters, then do not make use of arguments so that you don't cause any kind of error in your code. Okay, so here we have a very, very brief example of defining a function and calling a function. So this particular example we have here actually has a section of the function definition, and it has a section of where we called the function. And as you can see in this example, we began with the function keyword, which we would always begin with. After this, we'll give our function a name. You can see the name here is add underscore func, func. So I just shortened it for function, but no, don't really get concerned about that. Just know that this add underscore func we have here is the name of this function. So looking at this example, we can see that within this bracket we have variable x and variable y. And so this variable x and variable y here, they are actually parameters. So I made mention that if you make use of parameters, you must make use of arguments. So let's look at the definition first. We'll get to the arguments later. So after this parameters, within our curly braces, we have the actual code we want to run. And as you can see, we said let $sum be equals to x plus y. So here we have the $sum, which is a variable name, and the variable name here is giving the addition operation between variable x and variable y. So now this particular $sum we have here, we are outputting the value for the addition of this using the document.get element by id, which we already know about. We already know about this already. So this would actually output the addition of these two parameters on our browser. Now, leaving the definition of a function, let's go to the calling of a function. And you can see here that by calling a function, what we need is very, very brief and straightforward. So we have our function name here, add underscore func, which we have here in the definition too. And I made mention that the parenthesis is always important, even when you don't have any argument. So looking at this now, we have two arguments here, 3 and 5. Now I said that these arguments are values that will be passed into the parameters for the entire operation of the function to be executed. So this means that these 3 and 5 we have here will be passed into x and y. And then the moment they are passed into x and y, this particular operation we have here, x plus y, behind the scenes is actually going to be 3 plus 5. So whatever you have as the total value, which is 8, the value of 8 will then be assigned to this $sum. And here, when we print this on our HTML, we'd actually get the value of 8 on the screen. So you can see how easy this function is. Very easy, very straightforward, nothing difficult here. So let's imagine we never had 3 and 5 here. If we never had 3 and 5 here and we run this particular code exactly like this, you would actually have an error. And that's because x here will be a variable name, y here will be a variable name of no value. And so this $sum here will give you the value of undefined. So I believe by now we are already aware that when you do not initialize or assign a particular value to a variable name, the variable name by default we have a value of undefined. So this basically would be undefined plus undefined, and that would give you undefined. So the value of our sum here would be undefined. But because we have this argument here, we would actually get an integer value as our output rather than having the value of undefined. So one last thing before we go, I made mention of having a kind of mismatch between the parameters and the arguments. So imagine we had just the value of 3 here and not 5. This basically means that the value of x would be 3, but the value of y might not hold anything. So in order to avoid any kind of error, it's always better that you have the same number of parameters in the function, having equal number of arguments when calling the function. So that's actually how the function works, and that's that concerning the example. Now we have the return statement, and the return statement here is actually used in a function to stop its execution and to return a value to the function caller. So basically what the return statement here does is the fact that it actually executes a function, and then when it gets to that particular syntax where it has the return statement, it stops execution right there. And so after it stops execution right there, whatever the value of that variable is, it will actually transfer that value to where we called the function. That's the function caller. So by now we already know what the function caller is. It's actually when we call our function, and that is with the function name and the list of arguments, which is also optional. So here we have a brief example, but the difference here is that we actually made use of the return statement, and the document dot get element by id, as you can see, is not within the curly braces anymore. So for this particular example, looking at the definition of the function, you can see that we have our function keyword, our function name, list of parameters, and every other thing we need. But then if you look closely, after this particular let $sum be equals to x plus y, it is followed by saying return $sum. So what this will do here is that it's actually going to stop the execution of the program after this line. That's exactly on this line. So before stopping the execution of this entire function program, our $sum would already hold the value of 8, since we passed this particular argument here. And so once the $sum has the value of 8, the execution of the program stops. So that means any other thing we have after this might not be executed. It will just stop there. Now, looking at our function caller, or we could also call that where we called the function. Here we have the document.get element by id, which is equals to the function being called itself. So you can see here that there is a slight difference with the first example we saw. So here, the document.get element by id would be assigned the function caller, which is this function name and this list of parameters. So either of the examples you decide to follow, both would actually output the result of it on the browser. The only difference here is that we have our document.get element by id outside when we define the function, and for the other example, the first example we saw, we had this inside defining a function. So the moment you make use of the return statement here, you would most likely make use of the outputting outside the function. That's your document.get element by id, your document.write, document.class name, tag name, any form of outputting would be outside the function. But if you do not make use of the return statement inside this function, you can actually make use of the document that gets element by ID inside here also. So lastly, we have JavaScript function scope. So the function scope here is one of the scopes we have in JavaScript. And in this function scope, variables declared inside a function are known as local variables. So this actually means that when you declare a variable inside a function, they're actually under the local variables and not global variables. So for those who do not know, all variables that we have in JavaScript are basically of two different types. They are either local variables or global variables. Now, a local variable is a variable that has been declared within a particular block. So the function here is a particular block of code which is defined, under the function itself. So any variable you have declared inside the function is actually going to be a local variable. And now these local variables can only be used inside the function where it is declared. So this actually means that you cannot access a variable declared inside a function outside the function. So for the sake of understanding, I'll just go over it again. So I said variables in JavaScript are actually of two types: global variable, local variable. Now, a local variable is a variable that has been declared within a particular block. It can be a normal block which is under the block scope, or it can be declared within a function block which is under the functional scope, or what you would call a function scope. And so the block scope and the function scope actually work with local variables. Now, the other category of variables, which is the global variables, are actually variables that are declared outside a function. So far so good. Everything we've been doing from the very beginning of this program up until today in terms of creating variables, in as much as we did not make use of a block or a function when creating these variables, all the variables we've been using since they are all global variables. So this means that in as much as a variable is not declared within a block or within a function, that variable is most likely a global variable. And so being a global variable actually means that it can be used anywhere within the program. And the unique thing with global variable is this: global variables can actually be used within the program itself, and it can also be used within a function and a block. So this means that a global variable can actually work anywhere in your code. It does not have to be created within the function to work there. A global variable can work within a function. So it's like this generally accepted variable in your entire program. But then a local variable can only work in that function where it was declared. So this means that even if you have a separate function out there and you try to access a variable that was created in another function, it's not going to work. You can only access a local variable that was created in a function right in that function. So after this, we'll be getting to the practical demo of today's class, and hopefully we'll see how all this actually work with JavaScript functions. So here we've come to the end of the theoretical section, or what I would call, the storytelling section of JavaScript. And for this section we are about to begin with, we'll be looking into JavaScript practically on our VS Code. So let's move. So I'll create a new folder for this functions. I'll just call this functions. Have our HTML, and we would have our JavaScript. So next I'll make use of the boilerplate, which we already know how to do. Next thing I'll do is to connect our JavaScript file with our HTML to the main.js. So now we are all set. So I'll just create a list of HTML tags we'll be connecting with. Okay, so for this we'll create our first function. And now I said that the function here doesn't need parameters. So for this function, we are not going to have any parameters at all. This will be without parameters. So we'll begin with the function keyword, and then we give our function a name. Call this add underscore func. Next we'll have our parentheses and also our curly braces. So I guess we can all see the code now. So the next thing I'll do here is to actually put out something I want to execute. So I'll just say document.get element by ID, and we will just output something very simple, probably a string. Call this welcome JavaScript functions. So now we have this. So if I should save this now and output this on the browser, you can see now that we do not have anything displayed on the screen. And that's actually because we've not called the function. So the next thing I'll do here is to call the function, and you call it outside the function declaration. So here I would say add underscore func. If I save this now, nothing changes. It still doesn't work until we add the parentheses. And this now should actually give us the result. Welcome to JavaScript functions. So now you can see why the parenthesis is actually very, very important when calling a function, even when you do not have any arguments there. So it actually works now. And so the next one we'll be trying out would be functions with actual parameters. This one would be with parameters. And so again, you begin with the function keyword. I give this a name. Just call this sum. That's called function. And so the parameters I want to have here would actually be very, very simple. I'll just give this x1, x2, and x3. So now we have three parameters here in our program. So the next thing I want to do now is to actually pull out the block of code I want to execute with these parameters. So I would say let dollar sign sum be equals to x1 plus x2 plus x3. So this is something very basic, but then you can actually perform different kind of operations you want within your function. So we have the document dot get element by id, and I'll make use of the p2 inner html, and here I would actually output the dollar sign sum. So right now this is all what we need, for the function definition. So the next thing here would be to call the function name to be sum underscore func. And now within this parentheses, I would add the list of arguments we would make use of. So our x1 here would be 21, our x2 would be 32, and our x3 would be 10. So the addition of these numbers should actually give you 63. So we should have 63 in our, on the browser when we print this out. So if I save this now and we go back to the browser, you can see we have 63 right here. So this is very, very easily how you can make use of functions to do anything you want. And I made mention of the fact that these functions can be reusable. So for this, I'm going to copy this again. I'll give this another input. Here I would call this 11. Here I would just say 30. Call this 29. And this should give us the value of 70. So right now, there's only one problem we have. And the problem we have here is the fact that this document.get element by id can only print out just one of these, it can only print out just one of these functions we've called here. So because the HTML cannot hold multiple outputs, I'll make use of the document.write to print the second one. It will be document.write. Remember, this is actually being used because we can't have multiple outputs with one particular HTML element. So if I save this now, we should have the value of 70 and 63 on the screen. Okay, so we have the value of 70 now. Now for some reason here we have undefined. And I'm guessing that's because we actually have this running before this. But not to worry, you could actually make use of different inputs, but you need to find a way to do that. So let's try and see if we could even have multiple print statements here. To be P3. So I'm going to duplicate this now. But one thing I know here is the fact that both of these calculations will not be printed out. That one I'm sure of. Would only just have one of them being displayed on the two outputs. So you can see this gives us 123, 123. So this actually means that irrespective of the fact that we have these two called functions with different inputs, it would only print out the latest one we have here. That's this. So I think a quick solution to that would be to assign this particular function to a variable. And I will do that for this var. It will be equal to this. So if I save this now, we have 123 here. Document get element by id to be p3 dot inner html. The dollar sign var. And we should also have 123 appearing twice. Okay, gives us undefined. Okay, this actually shouldn't have happened. Okay, let's try with the document dot write. We still have undefined here. So I'm actually guessing this is happening because we can't actually define this here again. We've called the function just once, but then this should actually just do it by calling the function with the name here, which we've done so far. So this should give us 123 without undefined. Yeah. So the next thing I'll be doing now is making use of the return statement. And so for this one, we'll begin with the function name. Call this small underscore function. And we'll just give this some basic parameters of x, y, and z. So say let dollar sign mul equal to x asterisk y asterisk z. The next thing we have here is the return statement. And we are going to return the multiplication of these variables. This will be dollar sign mul. So now next thing we do here is to call our function, and then we'll pass in our values. I'll just go with 2, 3, and 4. I'll comment this out since we don't need this again. And you can see that nothing shows on the screen. And that's actually because we made use of the return statement here instead of the document dot get element by id, which we would use to output the result. So for this, we would have our document dot get element by id, and it's going to have the value for this particular function. So this gives us 24. So 2 times 3 times 4 would actually give us 24. So I made mention of something relating to having a mismatch. So let's imagine we had multiple arguments. We'll add 5 to this, and I'll save this now. You can see that it still gives us 24. So this basically means that it ignores the last argument we have here. The last argument of 5 here has been ignored. So it actually takes this according to the order at which they come, as in according to the order of their arrangement. So this begins with 2 here. 2 is assigned to the value of to the variable of x, 3 is assigned to the variable of y, and 4 is assigned to the variable of z. So to make this orderly, all I need to do is to add one more parameter here. I'll call this a, and if I save this now, it will actually still give us the same result. And that's because of the fact that despite the fact that we have this a here, which now holds the value of 5, we've not made use of this particular parameter in our code block. So to make use of this, I will just multiply this by 5, or by a rather. Now we should have a much bigger value, 120. So you can see very simply how this function actually appears. And now let's assume we have a here, but we don't have 5 here. If I save this now, you can see we get the NaN, and this NaN actually represents not a number. So this not a number output we have here is actually because of this particular variable of a. This a variable doesn't have a number being assigned to it. So the rest of them here, they all have numbers 2, 3, 4 being assigned to x, y, and z. But you can see that here a doesn't have any number. And so because it doesn't have any value attached to it, it would actually cause a problem for the rest of these variables. So take this out, and then we'll have a normal value of 24. So that's how the function works with the return statement. So lastly, we'll be looking into the function scope. And for this, I'm going to create a global variable called this dollar sign string. This would be sale virtual. So now I'm going to have a function here. Give this a name. Call this dollar sign concat because it's a concatenation function. Next thing I'll do here is to define another string, string2. This string2 would basically be our dollar sign string plus this particular text we have here. Next thing we have is the document dot get element by id. Now mind you, as I said before, you could make use of the return statement rather than this. But if you make use of the return statement, then your document.id will be outside. This will be equals to dollar sign string2. So the next thing I'll do is to call this function. So now if you notice very well, this particular dollar sign string here is actually a global variable. I said that global variable can be used anywhere within your program. So now we are making use of this global variable within this function, even when it wasn't declared here. So we should expect to have SEO virtual tech talent program. And you can see it, we have it right here. SEO virtual tech talent program. So now the next thing I'll do here is that I'm going to output this particular string, that's this dollar sign string2. I would output this outside the function. This would be p2. I think we have a p2 there. Yeah, okay, we have one. So now if I should save this, we shouldn't expect the output to be double, and as you can see, it doesn't even appear on the screen. And looking at it very well, even this particular outputting we have here, which is wrong, since we are trying to access this string2 that was declared in this function outside, it would also cause us an error for even the correct one we have inside here. And so for this not to happen, we would have to call this before this particular line. So I'm guessing this should do it. And yes, now we have SEO virtual tech talent program on the screen. So this particular output we have here is actually this one we have inside this function. And the reason it works now is because we called the function name before running this wrong one that we have here. So this one here is actually wrong. We should not try to do this. This is wrong. Trying to output a variable that was declared within a function. But here is the right way to do it. So this is right. This here is wrong. So I guess that's for introduction to functions. Hopefully we now know how to define a function, how to call a function, how to make use of the return statement, and we also now know about the function scope, which only works with variables that were declared within that function. So like I said before, the function actually goes a lot more after this, but having a good understanding of this class would actually help you out in learning more about functions. Thank you.